My name is Chow. I'm the technical manager for this session. Advances and challenges in the assessment of food choice behaviors and drivers, chaired by Samuel Scott, Sunny Kim, and Christine Blake. Thank you for taking part in ANH 2024, and we look forward to a robust and interactive session today. Thank you so much, and I'm going to hand it over to Christine Blake.
Great. It's my pleasure to open this learning lab. Welcome to all. I see more are coming in. So today we'll talk a bit about our work on advances and challenges in the assessment of food choice behaviors and drivers. And just to get us started, I'd like to give a little bit of background on how we came here today, why we decided to do this. Our motivation for delivering this lab comes from ongoing challenges that all of us have encountered when trying to collect data on food choice behaviors or drivers of food choice. A couple of years ago, our team here at the University of South Carolina, through our work with the Drivers of Food Choice program, partnered with researchers primarily at IF3 who were working on the Transforming Agriculture and Food Systems and South Asia initiative. And what started out as an effort to identify and incorporate assessment tools into a survey, a baseline survey, has morphed into this larger ongoing effort to identify and describe the applicability of existing tools, what they are, where they've been used, how they can be improved or adapted, but also to really highlight and clarify where the gaps are in this area and give some direction for next steps in the development of assessment tools, measures, metrics, etc. So today we're going to walk you through some preliminary results from systematic reviews and research applications to better understand assessment of food choice behaviors and drivers. We've built in ample time for reflection and discussion in our learning lab, so we hope to learn from you as well and get your input on what we have done and where you think this work needs to go. Our learning lab will be delivered in two parts. In part one, we have two speakers followed by a brief Q&A that will be led by Sunny, and we will then launch breakout rooms, so you'll have a chance to have smaller group discussions, and the instructions on those breakout rooms will be provided when you get there. I would now like to launch right into the content of our learning lab and introduce our first speaker, Morgan Bonstead. Morgan is a doctoral candidate in health promotion, education, and behavior at the University of South Carolina. Morgan is a public health nutritionist that conducts research at the intersection of climate change, food environments, and household science. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of our participants. As mentioned, this learning lab will be focusing on the assessment of food choice behaviors and their drivers. Advancing scientific progress in this area of food choice requires identification of what drives food choice and food choice behaviors, and identification of how to best assess these drivers and behaviors. Food choice is the process by which individuals and households decide on what to grow, gather, purchase, or obtain, and how to acquire, store, prepare, distribute, and consume the food they eat. This process involves a series of food-related decisions and behaviors that lead to the consumption of food within the context of a specific food environment. Food choice is not limited to food consumption alone. It is deeply intertwined with social and economic expression of identity, preferences, and cultural values that ultimately shape dietary intake and health outcomes. But what choices do people really have? Well, most people have some autonomy over what, when, where, with whom, and how they prepare, serve, and consume food. The degree of this autonomy, or lateral for food choice, varies by context and food environment. Despite numerous global commitments to improving nutrition, attempts to achieve ambitious goals are often hindered by our limited knowledge of drivers of food choice. This learning lab will summarize some of the work we have done to identify ways to measure food choice and the application of a simple tool to assess these drivers in a South Asian context. To orient us within the broader context of the food system, we're utilizing an adapted version of the high-level panel of experts food system framework. In this model, consumer behaviors, which includes food choice, serves as an intermediary between the food supply chain and dietary outcomes. As you can see, food choice occupies a central position within this food system framework. A growing body of work around food choice has highlighted the critical need to understand food choice behaviors and their drivers to guide actions to improve diets. Our team has responded to numerous inquiries regarding what to measure and how best to measure drivers of food choice. We found ourselves in need of a comprehensive list of constructs one could measure when trying to understand drivers of food choice and available tools that could be used to advance science in this area. In response, and as part of a larger body of work, we begun to develop this list. Through an iterative process, we developed and defined a list of constructs of drivers of food choice and food choice behaviors at the individual and household levels. We reviewed and synthesized existing food choice literature and conceptual models. Thematic analysis was used to define, group, and connect food choice constructs. However, we didn't want to merely identify potential drivers. Our ultimate goal was to advance the science, which involves actually measuring these constructs. Recognizing the resource-intensive nature of developing research tools, we sought to create a central repository of existing measures, instruments, and protocols. This repository is intended to be used for the development of protocols and analytic plans aiming to improve diet and facilitate the timely integration of drivers of food choice into food system and dietary assessments. We intended that this centralized location of tools would enable researchers to focus on refining and validating existing instruments rather than continuously reinventing the wheel. We identified 30 constructs one could measure when trying to understand drivers of food choice, which are grouped into 6 conceptually related categories that are shown in this figure. This list is not intended as a conceptual framework, but rather a comprehensive guide of potential drivers of food choice that could be incorporated in your study protocol. We're not suggesting that you incorporate every one of these constructs in your protocols, but rather providing a list of constructs to consider based on what's most relevant towards your research question. The food choice repository is organized by categories, constructs, and instruments. Through an iterative process, we identified and organized tools that align with our identified constructs. The repository contains the instrument or tool and any development or scoring material that was available. This repository includes both quantitative and qualitative instruments used to assess food choice across various life stages and contexts, with a particular focus on tools that are applicable in low and middle income countries. To illustrate, under the category food choice behaviors, we have the construct allocation, defined as what and how food is distributed across household members. One tool included in the repository is the Malawi Food System Focus Group Discussion Guide, which includes a section on food allocation. This repository is an ongoing development and by no means exhaustive. We welcome your feedback or suggestions about what tools are missing and should be included. In developing this comprehensive list of constructs and initiating the food choice repository, our goal was to facilitate the timely implementation of food choice measures in a research protocol. We quickly identified a significant gap in good quality measures of food choice behaviors and their drivers. While some tools do exist, they often lack thorough development and validation, accessibility, and standardization across different contexts. We found numerous ways to measure various aspects of food choice, yet comprehensive tools that assess multiple behaviors and drivers remain scarce, particularly in low and middle income countries. These findings highlight a critical need for robust, reliable, and contextually adaptable instruments to advance our understanding of food choice behaviors and their drivers. The first half of this learning lab provides an overview of the current state of evidence. The current state of evidence and measures. The second half will provide a practical application of specific examples of how we are utilizing current tools. We have 2 breakout sessions, which we'll hear from you all to help identify gaps in evidence and measurement, and to gather your insight on future research directions. Your active participation in these sessions will be crucial in shaping the next steps for this body of work. Up next, Sharvi will present findings from a systematically identifying evidence gaps in South Asia. Sharvi Padawan is a research analyst in nutrition, diets, and health unit at IFPRI based in New Delhi, India. Sharvi is a development economist by training and is interested in research at the intersection of health, nutrition, and agriculture.
Thank you for the introduction, Morgan. Hi, everyone. I'll be providing an overview of our systematic literature review on the measurement of food choice behaviors in South Asia. Recent studies on food choice behaviors have focused on the external food environment, and there has been limited assessment of drivers of food choice behaviors, or DFC, at the individual and household levels. For instance, Karanja et al. Examined DFC at the food environment as well as individual levels in low and middle income countries. However, there's still a dearth of reliable measurement methods to assess DFC at an individual level. There is a need to identify evidence gaps, as understanding food choice behaviors at a micro level is important for improving household diets. Keeping this in mind, our objectives are as follows: to identify studies that have measured food choice behaviors, specifically food acquisition, food preparation, or household eating patterns or behaviors and their drivers in South Asia, to identify methods used to measure food choice behaviors, and to identify key research gaps and propose future research priorities for food choice behaviors in South Asia. Food choice behaviors include food acquisition, food preparation, food allocation, waste and disposal practices, consumption behaviors such as feeding practices and household eating patterns, and food safety and storage practices. We noted that a systematic review was already conducted on intra-household food allocation in South Asia. Additionally, it was decided that while storage and disposal are important behaviors, they were of lower priority for our project's activities and measurement goals. Then within consumption behaviors, we specifically decided to focus on the way people eat rather than what people eat. Thus, the focus of the current evidence and methods review is on acquiring, preparing, and consuming food. Food acquisition refers to what people acquire, how they acquire it, and where they acquire it. Food preparation refers to actions performed to transform food from raw or partially or fully processed ingredients to a consumable form in the household. Household eating patterns are described according to their patterning, such as regularity, skipping, timing, format, that's the sequence of consumption of food groups, and context, like family meals, engagement in co-occurring behaviors, such as watching television. We conducted a scoping exercise to identify, test, and refine search strings for each of the food choice behavior of interest. The keyword search was restricted to the titles and abstract in 3 databases: PubMed, Web of Science Core Collection, and Scopus. These databases were selected as they were considered to have a comprehensive collection of literature on the topic of our interest. The database search results were exported to Ryan. After removing any duplicates, the titles were screened against the inclusion criteria, followed by abstract and full text screening. The inclusion criteria consisted of points such as: the study had to be from a country in South Asia, published in the English language between the year 2000 to December 2023. The study had to be peer-reviewed, involving a healthy population aged more than 5 years. The study had to measure at least one food choice behavior of interest and a driver at the household or individual level, and the study had to describe how the behaviors were measured. After compiling results from the 3 databases, we removed any duplicates using Ryan's duplicate removal tool. We manually screened titles, followed by abstract and full text screening. These were screened against our inclusion criteria, and we included a total of 47 studies for synthesis. Let us now dive deep into the results. Food acquisition behaviors were assessed by 24 studies. The themes assessed included frequency of food purchases, purchase behavior for specific foods, including organic foods, changes in food acquisition due to COVID-19, intra-household acquisition practices, and online ordering patterns. Quantitative surveys were the most commonly used tool to measure food acquisition behaviors, followed by focus group discussions. Photo voice was used to assess certain food acquisition practices. Food preparation behaviors were assessed by 8 studies. Intra-household food preparation responsibilities were assessed using interviews and photo voice of preparation practices. Cooking habits and meal preparation practices were assessed using qualitative interviews and quantitative surveys. Semi-structured interviews were the most commonly used measuring tool. Household eating patterns were assessed by 26 studies. The themes assessed included intra-household food allocation practices, foods consumed during eating occasions, eating habits or behaviors, snack consumption patterns, and eating out behavior. Quantitative surveys were the most commonly used tool, followed by semi-structured interviews. Some studies also used focus group discussions, and pile sorting was used to understand factors influencing consumption patterns. This heat map displays the evidence gap in DFC measurement. The columns are the food choice behaviors of interest. The rows include the country in which the studies were based and the different measurement tools used. We observed that most included studies were from India, and there were no studies from Afghanistan, Bhutan, and Maldives. We can also see that quantitative tools were more commonly used to assess food acquisition and household eating patterns, while qualitative tools like semi-structured interviews were more commonly used to assess food preparation practices. Based on the review and the different themes identified for each behavior, it is clear that a common set of constructs is needed to measure food choice behaviors. Further, a set of validated tools needs to be developed for each behavior, tools that can be adapted to different contexts. This review highlights the importance of a repository of measurement tools for future research on food choice behaviors. Thank you, everyone. I'll now hand over to Sunny for the Q&A session. Sunny Kim is a Senior Research Fellow in the Nutrition, Diets and Health Unit at IFPRI. Sunny conducts formative, process and impact evaluation research related to maternal, child and adolescent nutrition. Over to you, Sunny.
Thanks, Sharvari, and thanks, Morgan, for a fantastic presentation about the different constructs of drivers of food choice and the tool repository, which contains a lot of the tools that's been gathered by the DFC team in collaboration with IFPRI. And there's a link that's provided for the Dropbox with the repository in the chat, as well as a brief about that's been posted on the chat. And for Sharvari for sharing about the systematic review of what's out there in the DFC literature. And I just want to open up for the next about 7 minutes or so to take some comments, questions, anything about this first session is really kind of understanding and thinking and discussing about the different constructs of drivers of food choice and unpacking what we mean by drivers of food choice, as well as food choice behavior. So if you have any questions, please place them in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand, turn on your camera, and great. I see a hand from Karen.
Karen Shingle from CEW, India. So I work with the food systems team here. Thank you for a great presentation. My question was, in your literature, did you find any kind of ranking among different types of drivers? Like some drivers have a higher effect on their final choices versus some which rank lower, or was that not part of the scope of your research? And if it was, if you could share some insights.
Thanks for the question, Karan. So that was actually outside the scope of our literature review. But from what I remember, reading the 47 and sometimes 47 plus studies, there have been some studies that do look at ranked preferences among their among the sample that each study is looking at. So I do think there've been like sort of ordinal ranking studies. However, since that was not the scope of our review, I won't be able to elaborate on that, but I'd be happy to maybe look for some literature and share the same with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know that all of these presentations are so much to unpack, and there's a lot more details, especially when it comes to a systematic doing a review, and as well as the repository work with the DFC as well. Any comments? Maybe some of us are actually working on different parts of this, trying to also unpack the drivers of food choice, different constructs, which have been much more prominent in your field of work. So I just want to open up if you want to share or even make comments about what you've seen so far. I think everyone's getting warmed up. This is great. And again, you know, the repository is a work in progress, the Drivers of Food Choice repository. And in that tool that Morgan had shown, there's the different buckets of different drivers of food choice that was going from the person's state, the kind of the personal food environments, and all the different constructs that are in these different buckets. But again, they're not fixed buckets. And as Morgan was saying, that they're really the repository is an opportunity for us to kind of gather all of the materials that's out there and also to get your feedback. So do check out the repository and provide feedbacks as we continue to work on that repository and keeping up with what materials and assessments are out there.
Yeah, and I will echo on that. The work of the repository, as well as identifying what the constructs are, which we have definitions for every construct that we did identify. We are open to any feedback or suggestions on that. It's not a fixed list. It's definitely something that we would love to continue to work with. I see a question in the chat. It is fully open access, so it's currently hosted on Dropbox, and anybody can access that. The plan is to one day in the future put it into a more digital format that has more easier access to be able to see it, because it's very much a two-dimensional format in the current state. But there are plans to make it easier to be used by researchers. But as we work towards getting to that step, it is fully available for you to go ahead today, access it, and be able to see all that information, incorporate it into your current tools.
Yeah, there's a question from Jose asked, you know, commenting that the acquisition, the question is less about what, but is missing the whys. And acquisition is a food choice behavior that we often measure. How do you measure acquisition? What are they purchasing and so forth? But the whys would be those drivers of food choice that connect to that behavior of acquisition. So I don't know, Jose, if you want to elaborate more about that, but I don't know if Christine, Morgan, or others working on the drivers of food choice from the Drivers for Food Choice program that you've seen some of the experiences of studies or work that's been trying to unpack the whys of acquisition.
I am Jose.
Hi, Jose.
Hello. On some studies we have done down here in Bolivia about healthy food systems, we were concentrating our work very much on the production area. But when we went to the system and reached the final point, which is the consumption of food, the system was somehow broken. There was not a clear explanation of why people was consuming other kind of foods instead of the healthy foods. And we found that there were, as you say, many psychological maybe aspects very much influenced by other factors, like for instance, the marketing processes of many products, the propaganda. And it was very hard to change the system to face this kind of psychological influence of these processes in the society. That's why I was talking about that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And a lot of what we're trying to push towards is we can look at diet, we can measure diet, and that's what we've done in the past, but to be able to change what consumers are eating, to be able to shift the narrative towards a more healthy diet, we need to change what are their behaviors and then what drivers are influencing those behaviors. So we need to be able to measure the different types of behaviors, one of those being food acquisition, and then be able to assess what are, as you mentioned, more of these psychological drivers that are influencing those food acquisition behaviors. So it could be something like their preferences. It could also be something like their affordability towards those foods or different goals and motivations they have. Are they wanting to consume healthier food with the goal of losing weight? Or are they trying to increase the caloric intake for their children so that the children don't end up having nutritional deficiencies throughout their lifehood? So it's not just looking at what are these behaviors. If we're trying to influence diets, we also want to know what is driving the behaviors that are being influenced.
The concept of food acquisition that we're just kind of, we were talking about with Jose as well, is there's a comment from Kosu Yuan where is acquisition behavior same as his food purchasing? Well, not really, because acquisition, you could get it from neighbors and families and communities. You could be growing your own parts of your food that is acquired into your household and consumed or and shared. So there's acquisition is a broader terminology or a concept, and I think within that, purchasing is certainly a prominent way of obtaining foods. And we often think about acquisition because we do purchase from the markets if there's access to markets and availability, and that's another area of unpacking those aspects of drivers, but and the food environment as well. But purchasing is a prominent piece, but certainly there are other aspects of the acquisition behavior.
So you all were talking in your breakout rooms and the facilitators were entering your responses in a Google Sheet. I attempted to, in real time, pull them together in summary across the 4 rooms. The approaches you would use to assess food acquisition and intra-household food allocation, there was quite a bit of discussion around cultural drivers, such as cultural factors and context, importance of the social environment, discussions on resources to assess household income, income sources, who has the power to over income decision-making, obvious aspects of availability and accessibility and various ways to look at market assessment, specifically in specific contexts like near schools or interviews with canteens or menu observations. Some talk about influences on food acquisition like digital food marketing and social media. Children's motivations and eagerness to try new things, with nutrition not being a high priority, was also mentioned. Another set focused on looking at diet assessments as part of that and understanding acquisition, looking at what people actually consume, with a variety of different tools discussed, including DQQ and the MDD. So one mentioned infant young child feeding practices, or plate shared versus not, assess consumption of various food groups, and then some mention of different qualitative instruments and qualitative approaches that could be used to assess how you would assess food acquisition. I know there were many others that I was pulling as fast as I could. Things like food literacy, time available, food storage and food safety, gender equality aspects of food acquisition, sanitation and clean water availability, roles of the school system, asking what foods are purchased or not, mapping out routes, participatory social mapping, and a few others. In the discussion on what challenges and opportunities currently exist in assessing the food environment, I pulled a couple. There was definitely the sense the thought of, are there tools that measure food choice behaviors, or tools to assess these behaviors may not be easily available or accessible, which is part of the motivation for this learning lab and the work that we've been engaged in. A variety of discussions around cultural influence, challenges with diet assessment and recall, and measurement challenges across the board. getting at experiences, cultural barriers, lack of food and nutrition knowledge, difficult to measure, and then a few other aspects of food and nutrition practices, recall biases, things like the short attention span. One group was able to summarize in challenges and opportunities, challenges around assessing preparation practices, resources to follow food safety practices, how to measure leftovers, how to measure waste, that came up repeatedly, and then social norms that forbid consumption of certain foods, how to challenges around purchasing power or assessing household food waste. There are a variety of other comments as well. Specifically around, I think I actually captured most of what you all said in the second set. So I'd like to spend a couple minutes and open it up for large group discussion. If anyone has any comments about the vignettes, about the questions, or about anything that we've been engaging with in this first half of our learning lab. How are the breakout rooms? Any facilitators want to add anything?
I think our group was harnessing on the food choice behavior assessment because we kept talking about the drivers, right? A lot of the discussion was around the drivers of why, you know, in our vignettes, the person was behaving in that, you know, being influenced, and talking about lots of different the influences around the behavior of acquisition rather than the behavior measurement itself, which was super interesting.
Yes, and that line of thinking is part of, Sunny and I, we've been working on as part of the motivation for the work we're trying to do to clarify and conceptualize the distinctions between a behavior and the drivers of that behavior to improve measurement and improve our ability to predict and to target and to intervene to lead to healthy dietary intake, or to achieve the dietary outcomes that we are aiming to do through our interventions, and having a better understanding of the behavior and the drivers of that behavior. So your insights and comments throughout this learning lab will help guide us in that work as well. So we really welcome your feedback. So does anyone else from any other breakout room have a comment or thought at this time? Morgan?
Yeah, I was just going to share. It's interesting that you guys were caught more on the drivers. We were having difficulty. My breakout room had allocation. So being able to assess allocation itself instead of just looking at what are differences of household diets was a challenge that our group had, just because of the limited tools that do exist around household allocation, which is interesting to see that poll afterwards, that there actually are a lot of people that have experience looking at intra-household food allocation. And we were discussing how sometimes looking at specific food groups that are more high valued, you're able to assess those reasons behind allocation more readily than you would for more staple food products.
I wonder, you know, in our poll, there were a lot of folks working on actually different components of food choice behaviors and measuring that have experience. So if you have any tools or anything that you've used that is shareable, please do maybe share your links or any references inside the chat so that we can kind of collate some of the experiences you all have had. Any work that you have that you want to share with folks in this group, I think it'd be great if you could, you know, make copy any links or anything like that into the chat. Thank you.
Right. All right, so we are ready to transition now to our second half, and a shift here in our topics. And I'm going to hand it off to Sam Scott.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, so now we're going to shift over to research applications, and we'll hear 3 examples which stem from the TAFSA initiative in South Asia. So first, Sharaf Samin will be talking about a review of evidence from analysis of drivers of unhealthy food consumption. And then we'll hear from Sharvari again on individual drivers of healthy diets. And finally from Sunny, who was part of a review of behavior change interventions. So looking at more at solutions to addressing unhealthy food consumption. And I'll say that 2 of these presentations from Samin and Sharvi will be drawing on a tool that we adapted from researchers at the University of Washington, and that has been tested in Nepal with the Suhara data, which is a short tool about 9 items that does a kind of a rapid food environment assessment, and then we'll come back to that tool in the breakout for the part 2. So I'll go pass it over to Samin. Sharaf Samin is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Health Promotion, Education and Behavior, Arnold School of Public Health, University of South Carolina. And Samin's research is focused on understanding lived experiences of food environments and promoting healthy diets among adolescents in LMICs. Over to you, Samin.
Thank you so much, Sam, for introducing me. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is having a good time here. So my presentation will be consumption, sources, and perceptions of unhealthy foods among adults and adolescents in rural South Asia. We know South Asian nations have been undergoing a nutrition transition for last few decades, and a larger array of unhealthy processed and ultra-processed foods are available in formal and informal rural markets due to rapid urbanization and trade liberalization, increase the overall NCD risks among all age groups. So hence we know, understanding food choice behaviors and drivers that increase unhealthy food consumption is important. So the Transforming Agri-Food System in South Asia, which is the TAFSA Integrated Food System Assessment, was conducted from February to April in 2023 across 5 rural districts of 3 South Asian countries, Bangladesh, Nepal, and India. So 2 rural districts, Rangpur and Rajshahi, were selected in Bangladesh. 2 districts, Bankhe and Surkhet, were included in Nepal, and 1 district, Nalanda, was included in India. So villages were the primary sampling unit, and 25 villages from each district were selected, and from each village, 20 households were recruited. So finally, 6,007 adults and 3,995 adolescents were interviewed. And among the adults, 66% were female and 34% were male. And among the adolescents, the ratio was almost 50-50. The dietary assessment was conducted, and 24-hour dietary recall was conducted using the Global Diet Quality Score GDQS application, which included 7 unhealthy food groups, and also a 7-day food frequency of 25 commonly consumed foods was done as well, and that list included 6 unhealthy foods. Other assessment of selected drivers of food were included like unhealthy food sources, unhealthy food advertising exposure, and as well as perceptions of unhealthy foods. So the key findings of unhealthy food consumption was among all the unhealthy foods, sweets and ice cream had the highest daily consumption for all 3 countries among both adults and adolescents. And overall, adolescents consumed more sweets and ice cream, fried foods both at home and purchased, as well as sugar sweetened beverages on a daily basis than adults in all 3 countries. We also measured the unhealthy food eating occasions, and we found that both adults and adolescents in Bangladesh consumed unhealthy foods 1.5 times higher on different eating occasions per day compared to Nepal and Indian respondents. And in Bangladesh, most of the unhealthy foods were consumed in the afternoon, while in India and Nepal, unhealthy foods were mostly consumed in the morning hours. We also measured the sources of unhealthy food purchased, unhealthy foods, and for 6 commonly consumed unhealthy foods in 3 different countries. And we found that most unhealthy foods were purchased from open air markets in Bangladesh. We call them, it's called Haat, which means open air market. And in Nepal and India, unhealthy foods were mostly purchased from retail shops and other sources like weekly market, city market, mobile vendor or road market, etc. While measuring the exposure to unhealthy food advertisement, we found that adolescents were more exposed to unhealthy food advertisement compared to adults in the past month. And exposure to soft drink advertisement was the highest for all groups, followed by salty packet snacks and fried foods. And most of these exposure were through the mass media channels like television, radio, social media, newspaper, etc. However, adolescents were also receiving more information on avoiding unhealthy foods than adults. So at the same time, adolescents were more exposed to unhealthy food advertisements, but they were also receiving more information on avoiding unhealthy foods. And they mostly received this information through media or school teachers or family and friends. These were the primary sources. So this high consumption of unhealthy foods alongside exposure to both ads promoting unhealthy foods and messages avoiding unhealthy foods kind of suggests that there may be some individual level drivers that influence unhealthy food consumption among all age groups. So the TUFSA integrated food system assessment measured the perceptions of unhealthy foods, two commonly consumed unhealthy foods, which were biscuits and fried foods, using this questionnaire. And you can see different domains such as availability, accessibility, affordability, convenience, desirability, and perceptions of safety and quality were assessed based on respondents' agreement to these statements. My next speaker will elaborate more on this questionnaire. So I'll show you the result when we measured the perceptions about consuming perceptions about biscuits and fried foods, and we found that biscuits were perceived as safer and more nutritious in Bangladesh and India than in Nepal, as well as biscuits and fried foods were more affordable in Bangladesh than other countries. And also we found that adolescents considered biscuits and fried foods tastier than adults across all three countries. So the key takeaway points from here is, like, as we have seen, that among all unhealthy foods, sweets and ice cream is more common among adults and adolescents in South Asia, and in Bangladesh, like the unhealthy food consumption is mostly in the afternoon, whereas in Nepal and India, unhealthy foods are commonly consumed in the morning hours. And also we have seen that the adolescents know of shops selling unhealthy foods, so they consider more available unhealthy foods around them, and they also think it is easier to acquire these foods for them. So further research on how exposure to different unhealthy food advertisements, as well as perceptions or individual level drivers of unhealthy foods related to consumption of these foods are required. So next speaker, the next speaker, Sharvari, will explain more about the individual level drivers on this, and her presentation will be a review of new evidence from analysis of individual drivers of healthy diets in South Asia. And Sharvari Patwardhan is a research analyst in the Nutrition, Diets and Health Unit at IFPRI, based in New Delhi, India. And Sharvari is a development economist by training and is interested in research at the intersection of health, nutrition, and agriculture. Over to you, Sharvari. Thank you.
Thank you, Sameer. Hello again. I'm going to walk you through a quantitative approach to analyzing the individual level drivers of diets in South Asia. Drivers of food choice behavior, or DFC, span individual and household levels. DFC is also shaped by broader community and macro factors. While recent studies have focused on the external food environment, there has been limited quantitative assessment of DFC at the individual level, particularly about whether individual perceptions about certain food attributes relate to consumption behavior. Hence, our objective is to understand how individual level factors influence consumption among household members in rural districts of South Asia. The Turner framework highlights the external and personal food environment domains that impact food choice behavior. The focus of our analysis is on the individual level domains visible on the right side of this figure. We collected primary data from Rajshahi and Rangpur in Bangladesh, Nalanda in India, and Banki and Surkhet in Nepal. I'll highlight a few key sample characteristics. The total sample size for our analysis was 3,992 households, and the respondents included adult females, adult males, adolescent females, and adolescent males. Many households were missing adult males due to migration, and female-headed households were more common in Nepal. Now we look at the percentage of respondents who consumed certain foods in the past 24 hours. We observed that there was relatively lower consumption of dal in Bangladesh compared to India and Nepal. There was relatively higher consumption of eggs in Bangladesh and relatively lower green leafy vegetables consumption in India. There was relatively higher biscuit consumption in Bangladesh, and there were similar levels of banana and fried food consumption across the countries. Primary data was collected on individual perceptions about their personal food environment in Module B4 of the questionnaire. Respondents were requested to agree, disagree, or neither agree nor disagree to certain statements. The statements were posed for a predetermined list of foods that we call sentinel foods. The sentinel foods list includes dal, eggs, green leafy vegetables, banana, biscuits, and fried foods. We mapped these statements to the domains in the Turner framework. For instance, the statement, given my income, dash are not too expensive, was mapped to the affordability domain. In the last row, we include the statement, I know a shop who sells dash, referring to availability. This has been included as a control for the external food environment. The perception indicators were asked for 6 sentinel foods across the locations. These foods were selected as they were commonly consumed across location, and they each represent a different food group classification. We analyzed 5 drivers of food choice: affordability, accessibility, desirability, convenience, and perceptions of safety and quality. These drivers were selected as the inner domain of the Turner framework, and perceptions of safety and quality were also included as they have been linked to desirability. Due to this large number of dimensions that are relevant for our analysis, we decided to use a principal component analysis approach, or a PCA, to reduce dimensionality. For the PCA, we focused on the agree responses to the statements from Module B4. The dummy variable takes the value 1 if the agree response was chosen. This dummy variable was generated for all the sentinel foods. The responses for all sentinel foods were then added up, and the addition was divided by the total number of the food group sum to standardize the scores. 3 score variables were generated this way for all foods combined, for healthy sentinel foods, and just for unhealthy sentinel foods. Each score ranges from 0 to 1. For the first PCA, we used the indicators for healthy and unhealthy foods. Factor loadings of less than 0.3 have not been displayed here for clarity. Component 1, or PC1, loads on knowing the vendor for healthy and unhealthy foods and easy to acquire healthy and unhealthy foods. Hence, we refer to this domain as accessibility. The second component is labeled affordability. The third component is labeled desirability just for healthy foods, as the factor loadings are on is nutritious just for healthy foods and family enjoys eating healthy foods. Similarly, the last 2 components are labeled convenience and safety perceptions and desirability just for unhealthy foods. We observe that the factors have loaded as hypothesized in our earlier table. We ran a PCA with indicators just for green leafy vegetables. Component 1 here loads on green leafy vegetables being not expensive and easy to acquire. Hence, we call that affordability and accessibility. Similarly, the other components derived from the PCA were labeled desirability and convenience, just desirability, safety perceptions, and accessibility. We ran a logistic regression to examine how the PCA predictions impact the dependent variable, that is, consumption of green leafy vegetables. The model includes controls for gender, age, wealth, years of education, household size, and district fixed effects. Standard errors have been clustered at the household level. We observe that with more desirability for green leafy vegetables, the higher the green leafy vegetable consumption. Estimates for the other indicators were not significant. Now let's examine the PCA estimates for indicators about fried food. The components derived from this PCA are safety perceptions, desirability, accessibility, affordability, and convenience. Logistic regression estimates show that accessibility and desirability have a positive impact on fried foods consumption. The more the affordability and accessibility of fried foods together, the higher the fried foods consumption. Convenience and safety perceptions do not have a statistically significant impact on fried foods consumption. Some of the key takeaways from our analysis are that the principal component analysis results in factor loadings as hypothesized. That is, the survey statements that were directly mapped to certain drivers is confirmed by the PCA results. We identified two types of desirability: desirability for healthy foods and desirability for unhealthy foods. We also observed that the drivers differ for healthy and unhealthy food consumption. Thank you, everyone. I'll now pass it on to Sunny to talk about a literature review on behavior change interventions.
Thanks, Sharvari. So I'm going to be switching gears a little bit. The first two presentations were really a lot of results from and findings from about food consumption behaviors and patterns, dietary patterns, and drivers of food choice measures. But I'm going to be talking about a recent social scoping review that with colleagues named here that we did and looking at then the application of all of this, which is really the behavior change interventions and the literature that exists now and the evidence to address unhealthy food consumption. So Samina already talked about, in real time, at least in the South Asia context, using the TAFSA data set, some of the shifts in the dietary patterns. So this is why we focused on this particular outcome of unhealthy food consumption and not necessarily on, the other behavior, dietary behaviors outcomes such as dietary diversity or others that have been studied here. So behavior change interventions employ techniques such as nutrition education, goal setting, self-monitoring, providing feedback and support. There's also substitution to change behaviors or shifting or changing people's social and physical environments. And these are really implemented at the individual, household, community, and broader levels. Behavior change interventions in LMICs have mostly focused on promoting healthy foods such as the fruits and vegetables or increasing dietary diversity. And there's a lot of growing evidence on these outcomes. So the evidence on the behavior change interventions to address unhealthy food consumption, however, have focused really on single food and beverage types or nutrient types, such as sugar-sweetened beverages or added salt intake. So for our scoping review, we wanted to assess the size and scope of the global evidence on behavior change interventions addressing unhealthy food consumptions across a wide range of outcomes, not just on SSBs or sugar-sweetened beverages or salt intake, added salt intake, but kind of open that up and see what the global evidence is. This work was done under TAFSA, but it's not focusing on South Asia region only. Next slide. So Sharvari presented something very similar for this a systematic review in the first part, but we went to 3 different search engine sites and looked through the literature and did a title aptitude screening and also did full text review. So most of this was published literature that had outcomes on reported outcomes of behavior change interventions on a unhealthy food consumption outcome. So there were no qualitative studies included here, and all of this records were from 2000 onwards. But we excluded those studies that are looking at high-risk populations with special clinical and therapies needed, no outcome on where there's no reporting of unhealthy food consumption outcomes, and when especially no BCI, or if they're only policy instruments, for instance, food tax or food subsidies and those other interventions that are addressing unhealthy food consumption without a behavior change intervention component directly to beneficiaries, those were not included in this scoping review. And we had 145 papers included. So this is a description of the studies, the 145 studies, and I'll just pull out some of the main findings from there, is that only 28 of the 145 studies were from LMICs. So less than 20% of the evidence that we found from the year 2000 onwards of behavior change interventions, published behavior change interventions, literature was coming from LMICs. They were mostly on adults and older or adolescents, and much less on the young children, although there are some studies emerging about intervening with children under up to 5 years of age. Common intervention settings were in the schools, obviously for the children and adolescents, digital platforms, and the community-based setting. And all of the interventions included the intervention type of information, providing information or giving some sort of education and communication. And this can be through counseling, providing brief messages, or using mass media. So nearly all of the studies were using this type of intervention. Most of our scoping review is then focused on unpacking the intervention type, but I'll just give you a few glimpses of some of the other relevant for this group here findings from the scoping review. Next slide. And the other outcomes, or the outcomes that were reported predominantly were in addressing sugar sweetened beverages and packaged salty snacks and fast foods, and followed by sweets. So much less the evidence of behavior change interventions addressing some of the other types of foods and foods here. And, although we were focused more on unpacking the interventions and which align to the different outcomes, we did look at which of the studies reported on any or mentioned any of the drivers of food choice in their pathway or mechanism, or explaining their results by reporting on drivers of food choice. And 62 out of the 145 reported on any drivers of food choice to address behavior change related to unhealthy food consumption. And most of them were trying to address knowledge, attitudes, and belief, followed by their motivations and expectancies. Less so much on self-efficacy, preferences, habits, and routines, and social relationships. So a lot more on concrete that are much more tied to some of the IEC, or information, education, communication strategies for knowledge, attitudes, and belief. So the last two slides, I just wanted to show you in qualitative terms a bit of how some of the reporting of impacts on these papers were to the different different outcomes here. For instance, we have in red the number of studies that had provided or reported positive impacts on different outcomes that are listed in horizontally in the x-axis. And then in the gray bars are those that are reporting on null impacts. And of course, they're subject to bias, and these studies were actually quite varied in design. But more than half the studies reported impacts in reducing saturated fat, at the table salt, sugar sweetened beverages, and packaged snacks and fast foods. We were actually more interested in about these null impacts reported, which was more on studies targeting processed meats and sweets. So again, kind of we tried to look at in the series of different characteristics of the studies to be able to see where there were differences on reported impacts. We didn't conduct a meta-analysis or a full systematic review on these outcomes, given the various different designs of these studies. but this is a way to be able to identify where there were more positive or negative null impacts reported on these studies. And the last kind of finding slide that I have here is about the multi-component or the different information, education, communication interventions that were reported. So on the left, 3, looking at studies that had tried to address social sugar-sweetened beverages, packaged snacks, and sweets. This was through by providing just information. This may be through mass media, just providing some audiovisual messaging, and the number of studies that had positive or null impacts reported. In the 3 in the center is the counseling, whether there was an interpersonal contact, studies that had included interventions that made a personal contact through one-to-one individual or group counseling sort of strategies. And then to the right are these multi-component, which may be combining one or more strategies. And here, certainly the counseling multi-component elements, there were more of, for certain outcomes, that there were more positive outcomes that were being reported from the studies, and compared to just providing some information alone. Although for the packaged snack, it's kind of consistent across the 3 different modes of intervention. So this is kind of where we've packed and tried to understand where the evidence of the interventions and the different begin to kind of look across the different outcomes of unhealthy food consumption, and not just specifically on SSBs or whatnot, or just sugar sweetened beverages or fried foods. We tried to look across a whole range of different outcomes. So really the takeaway is that there's really very little evidence from LMICs, which are underrepresented, and is a critical gap given that there's a high burden of malnutrition and rising NCDs and the ongoing nutrition transition. And we really want to build up this evidence on looking at ways to change, building up the evidence on different interventions that may be able to contribute to understanding on how to shift behaviors. There's scarce reporting of drivers of food choice underlying the behavior changes and the outcomes achieved. And I think this is really important when, especially on behavior change interventions, to include that, to have a better understanding on the pathway and mechanisms. Lastly, the areas for future research, really examining how the drivers of food choice linkages with intervention effects on unhealthy food consumption and health outcomes needs to be examined, as well as the duration and sustainability of these behavior change interventions and their effects, which always is something we need to continue to gather information about. And I think that's it. Thank you. And over back to you, Sam.
Yeah, thank you, Sunny. Thank you, Samin and Sharvari. We have 22 minutes left in the session, so I'm going to ask if we could just maybe have 2 burning questions before we move to the last breakout. So unfortunately, that was very rushed, and I don't think people got quite to the second question, but I'll quickly read out some points that I saw being discussed, which I thought were interesting. And then I'll pass to Christine to close. I don't think we will really have time for more discussion. So the breakout's focused on the new tool that we used in the TAFSA surveys to assess perceptions or kind of the drivers of food choice. And it was the respondents' perspective, right, on different factors that may have affect their food choices. So one comment was that there was a question on, do you know of a vendor that sells the food, but there could be more vendor characteristics that affect food choices, such as whether or not they're certified or where they are, or whether the respondent has a relationship with that vendor. The tool may need to be adapted for different types of respondents. We could, adjust the questions for smallholder farmers, for example. And I'll just note here that this is not, a really standard, widely used, validated tool. So there's plenty of room, I think, to adapt for various contexts or respondents. there was one room that noted different cognitive processes are involved when asking the questions, and this is related to the tool being a subjective assessment. And yes, a good comment that it should be compared or complemented by an objective measure such as a market survey. And this is one thing that we have been exploring with TAFSA because we did have a market assessment. So we are kind of comparing the observed versus measured, the experience versus measured food environment. The tool is skewed more towards the personal rather than the external factors, right? More questions are asking about their personal factors rather than the food environment. And I think that was intentional, but it doesn't affect how we interpret the findings from the tool. And then finally, there may need to be additional questions or different types of questions based on what foods we are asking about or the type of environment. Maybe if you're asking about special foods, medicinal foods, for example, or let's say fermented foods, or if you're in an urban environment, we may need to ask different types of questions than we asked in this rural South Asia environment, where we kind of ask generally about commonly consumed foods. So I'll stop there, and I hope people have opportunities to continue discussing because I know that was very short. So back to you, Christine.
Great, thank you, Sam. And I want to, we have about 2 minutes, so I just have a couple of wrap-up points I'd like to make, kind of summarizing today's discussion. And I first want to thank all of our speakers for their excellent presentations, and the facilitators for leading the breakout rooms, and all the participants in those breakout rooms and here engaging in the chat and online, and just being here with us while we grapple with these concepts. A couple of closing points just to wrap this up. I think we would all agree diets are changing globally, and concerning increases in consumption of unhealthy foods is particularly a problem, as Samin noted in his presentation on ultra-processed foods. Also, just a reminder that as we're thinking about how people or why people are eating the way they do, that the decision, the actual behaviors and choices of what to consume happen at that nexus where an individual is meeting the food environment. And efforts have been underway for many years to advance our ability to assess food environments objectively, as was just discussed. But less attention has been given to the human side of that. We might have an objective measure of a food environment, but it doesn't perfectly predict why people are eating the way they do, or how much they eat, or what they choose. There are other human processes involved in that not just decision-making process, but in those behavioral processes. One of the key points I think I hope everyone walks away with today is that conceptual clarity on what causal pathways that lead to dietary intake through food choice behavior and drivers of these behaviors, to understand those causal pathways, is essential for design and implementation and evaluation of nutrition interventions that improve healthfulness of diet. So distinguishing between dietary intake, food choice behavior, and drivers of behavior. So today we set out to better understand some of the food, how to measure those food choice behaviors, and try to explore different avenues. And we've learned along the way that there's a shocking dearth of evidence on how to accurately and consistently assess food choice behaviors, which makes it virtually impossible to assess drivers of what we don't know how to measure. So I think I want to end this learning lab by saying I ask all of you to be thinking about, how do we better clarify the behavior or behaviors that we're interested in that are contributing to dietary intake, and improve our measurement, both accuracy, reliability, and validity of our measurement of those behaviors, and consider this a call to action in the food choice community. So I want to thank you all, and I hope you have a lovely day.